Warning. Unknown frequency detected. Running diagnostic scan. Switching to backup generators.
Hello there. I'm glad you found us. Or rather, I'm glad that we have found you. Make yourself comfortable and join us for tonight's haunting short story titled The Final Page, written by Victor Toll. The story is about a man who stumbles upon a book, a purple leather hardcover with gold trim on the pages to be precise. This book is not what it seems, and reading it has some unexpected consequences for our protagonist. Dare to be scared? Now I present to you The Final Page, written by Victor Toll and narrated by me, Justice Burnaugh. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. The front door to his mother's house was unlocked when Alan arrived holding a Mother's Day card in one hand and a bouquet of flowers in the other. He let himself inside using his spare key and went to the kitchen where he filled a crystal vase with water for the flowers. He set the flowers in the sunlit kitchen window and propped the unopened card against the vase. He wanted to surprise her. The house was unusually silent. He called upstairs for her, and when he got no response, he began to worry. It had been a couple days since they spoke on the phone. His mind naturally began wandering to dark places as he searched the house. He imagined opening her bedroom door and finding her motionless on the floor, but she was nowhere to be found. His mother's disappearance was so sudden, and her whereabouts so unknown, that you could say she vanished. No bags were packed. Her car keys hung on the hook by the front door where she always left them. The thermostat was at its usual 71 degrees Fahrenheit, not turned down to a cool 55 degrees, as was the case when she left on vacation, which was seldom. There were dirty dishes in the sink and fresh groceries in the cupboards and fridge. For the most part, everything was in its usual place, aside for an odd detail that Alan noticed when he entered the private library. It was something only he would notice. Lying on the floor beside the upholstered reading chair was a book. The title of the book was Lickabones, a collection of scary short stories written by Simon Knight, an author Alan had never heard of. The book was a purple leather hardcover with gold trim on the pages. Each short story starred the chief character of Lickabones, a skeleton who lurks in the dark and is always concocting new ways to scare unsuspecting children. Lickabones was an odd title for a book in his mother's library, Alan thought, lifting it from the floor and flipping through its pages. His mother was a reader of nonfiction. Her shelves were filled with biographies and dry historical volumes. She didn't care for flowery language and long descriptions. She was a reader of facts and information, who thought fantasy was trivial and fiction altogether unsatisfying. And yet, lying beside her chair was a book filled with scary bedtime stories. That the book should be lying carelessly on the floor was also strange. Books in his mother's library had only two places, on the shelf or sitting on the antique table by her reading chair. They never left the library, and they certainly were never left on the floor. And so finding a book of scary short stories on the floor in his mother's library was as shocking to Alan as it would have been to find the front door kicked in off its hinges. The book immediately filled Alan with a deep nostalgia for the campfire stories of his youth. His mother thought such stories of ghouls and haunted houses were dribbling nonsense, a complete waste of ink and paper that stunted the developing young brain. And so Alan got his scary stories not from his mom, but from his grandmother whenever she came to babysit him on the weekends. The scary stories his grandmother read were all framed in the same narrative structure of something monstrous creeping steadily closer. announcing its approach with creaking floorboards and open windows with curtains flapping in a soft breeze. No matter how many times his grandma would read him the same stories, Alan clung tensely to every word, nervously watching the shadows in the far corners of his room. Even as a child, Alan enjoyed being scared, even when it made his nights long and gave him nightmares. Before he knew it, Alan was sitting in his mom's reading chair and eagerly reading through Lickabones with an excitement he had not known since he was a boy. The book opened with a grimly whimsical poem about the legend of the skeleton named Lickabones. The poem read as follows. There once was a skeleton that shivered. His bones rattled and quivered. He leapt from his grave and hatched a charade to find a skin that delivered. He dreamed of a skin that fit just right, something snug, but not too tight. A skin supple and smooth to hug his grooves and keep him toasty through the night. Into his skull a thought crawled in, so sly and cunning it made him grin. He hatched a scheme to make children scream and scare them out of their skin. Slide, creep, crawl, rattle, and tiptoe. Where he hides you never know. Hear the door squeak and the floorboard creak. His name chills you deep in your marrow. Lickabones, Lickabones, Lickabones. A name to scare the skin off your bones. Bony and thin, he slips under your skin. Lickabones, Lickabones, Lickabones. Before Alan could set the book down and resume his search for his mother, he was already flipping to the next page. Whenever his mind would stray to worry about his missing mother, another sentence would pull him back to the book. The words were so entrancing, and the story so enthralling, that it was impossible to focus on anything other than the words before him. Everything beyond the border of the page fell completely out of focus. His eyes scanned rapidly, left to right, consuming the words with a frantic energy. Alan was normally a slow reader, someone who is easily distracted by the slightest sound or passing thought. Novels spent weeks on his nightstand before he finished them. Now the paragraphs poured into his mind. Once, he flipped a page so rapidly that he received a paper cut on his finger. He gave it no notice, even though the sight of blood normally made him queasy. The blood dribbled down his palm as he continued reading, his bloody fingerprints staining the pages. With every word he read, the enchantment grew stronger, overwhelming his mind with intense joy and excitement. Neither hunger nor thirst was enough to pull him from the book. He was numb to everything beyond his desire to read the next page. Time was irrelevant. Hours melted away as he read through the night. He reached the final chapter, a short story titled Overcoat. This was the story he read. Chapter 37, Overcoat. A heavy frost fell over the graveyard and the surrounding countryside. A sheen of ice covered everything from the iron fence to the headstones that glittered in the moonlight. A feral dog scampered through the cemetery with the leftovers of a bloody chicken in its mouth. It cut through the cemetery often on its way to and from its den beneath the mausoleum. Very few came to the cemetery anymore. There was nobody to bring flowers and lay wreaths before the headstones. The graves were dug too long ago, and the bereaved had since joined those buried below. The heavy metal doors to the mausoleum were fastened with a thick iron chain and a padlock too rusted to open with a key. The only visitor these days was the mangy dog that cut a path through the tall grass. The dog ate its meal beside an ancient-looking headstone. The chicken carcass popped and snapped as the hungry dog extracted every morsel of meat and blood from the bones. So ravenous and noisy was the dog in eating its meal that a skeleton below was stirred awake. The skeleton hugged his shivering bones, for his coffin was rotten and full of holes, and the cold air made his teeth chatter in the gloomy grave. The warm blanket of muscle and fat had been clean picked from his bones ages ago, when coffins were carried in wagons, and the nights were bright with lantern light. Between the bitter cold and the annoying sound of the dog eating above, the skeleton had no mind for sleep. Mustering what strength was left in his dusty bones, the skeleton leapt from his grave in a burst of flying dirt and rotting coffin wood. The The dog and chicken carcass were carried off into the sky in an explosion of dirt. The startled dog landed with a thud and scurried off, yelping back to its den beneath the mausoleum. The skeleton sprung gracefully from the hole. He stretched his bones in the moonlight, for he was buried long ago, and his joints were stiff. A breeze whistled through his rib cage, and he began shivering again. He wished for a blanket, something he could wrap around his bones to stave off the biting cold. Down the hill, nestled in the valley below the cemetery, was a village. It was larger and brighter than he remembered. He stared enviously at the homes, imagining the inhabitants sleeping snugly and warmly in their soft beds. It wasn't fair that they should pass the night peacefully, while he faced the cold without so much as a skin to keep him warm. So long as he was denied the eternal sleep promised at his funeral, he would need something to keep him warm. He thought for a moment of finding the dog that so rudely roused him from sleep to the cold reality of an afterlife. The dog's fur would provide a warm enough blanket once the dog was properly skinned, but the dog's fur was filthy and probably infested with fleas. He needed a skin that was suitable for a human skeleton. The name on his tombstone had faded long ago. He ran his bony fingers over the smooth, blank surface that once bore his epitaph. The elements stole his name, as well as his flesh. He had few memories beyond the gloom of the grave. His former life was a hazy dream, and so he decided to give himself a new name, a name suitable for a skeleton. As the skeleton sat on his headstone, gnawing thoughtfully on a leftover chicken bone, a name slithered into his cobwebbed cranium. If ever a skeleton could grin, he did so in that very moment. He grinned so venomously that the wind died, and the moon hid itself behind the silver clouds. Compelled by whatever spell that allowed him to speak without the aid of cheeks, lips, or tongue, the skeleton spoke the name that would thereafter haunt the dreams of the villagers below. "I am Lickabones," he yelled triumphantly, twirling and leaping gleefully among the tombstones. As he danced, his bones jangled all together in a hollow, macabre melody that made the trees shudder and the cemetery gate groan on its hinges. The worms and the spiders scattered from him, tunneling deeper into the earth at the sound of his wretched name. He reached the border of the cemetery and leapt high over the fence, landing on the other side with a somersault before springing to his feet. His wild acrobatics were more than his bones could handle, and in the process his skull popped off and rolled laughing and bouncing down the hill into the village. After a few fumbles and some more laughter, the skeleton caught his skull and fastened it back onto his neck. His bones rattled and his feet clacked upon the asphalt streets which had been dirt when last he walked upon them. A cold breeze swept down the empty street and chilled his shivering bones. He tried to warm himself by a street light, but the buzzing light did not hold the same warmth as the oil lamps of years ago. Walking by a shop window, he looked longingly at the mannequins dressed in heavy jackets and trousers. With his slender finger bones, he tried the lock to the front door until it clicked open, and he glided into the dark store where he began trying on clothing to warm his freezing bones. But the trousers slipped off his skinny legs, and the jackets hung in folds from his narrow arms and rib cage. Clothing was too loose and baggy to keep a skeleton warm. He needed something tighter to wrap around his freezing, chattering bones. There was little he remembered about his life among the living, but of what he did recall, he remembered wearing heavy wool overcoats during the winter. But that was back when he had muscles and flesh to fill clothes. If he had eyes, he would have cried as he looked down at his dry, white bones. Fluffy white flakes of snow were sprinkling around him as he roamed around the village. He wondered if there were other skeletons like him, or if he alone were cursed with the ability to retain sensory perception long after death and the loss of all flesh and nerve. The only warmth left in his bones was a smoldering anger toward whatever god or magic abandoned him to this lonely existence. More than anything, he was angry at the thought of everyone in the village sleeping snugly in their soft beds, their bones nestled in all those toasty layers of warm, soft skin. He reached the end of Jasper Avenue where a single home stood tall and alone amid the sprinkling snow. The The house was quiet and dark, except for an upstairs bedroom window that glowed with a warm yellow nightlight. The house sat on a large, secluded lot enclosed by a tall metal fence. The bars were too slick and frosty for him to climb over, so Lickabone slipped narrowly between the bars. It was a tight squeeze, even for a skeleton, and he twisted and wiggled his way carefully through the gap. He crept around the house in search of an entrance until he found an unlocked kitchen window. But the window was sealed tight with ice and was difficult to open. With a loud clatter, Lickabones pried open the window and climbed into the warm house. The sound alerted the teenage son who had been lying awake in an upstairs bedroom. His father was due home from a business trip, and he had the habit of returning at odd hours of the night. Downstairs, Lickabones was grateful for the warm refuge from the blustering storm outside, but he still felt that pestering chill deep in his marrow. He went to the closet in the mudroom and began rifling through its contents in search of some warm article of clothing to wrap around himself, but all the mittens, scarves, and jackets in the world could not overcome the nagging chill that haunted his bones. A pile of discarded winter clothing surrounded him. The only remaining item hanging in the back of the closet was a thick, woolen overcoat, just like the kind he remembered wearing so long ago when he was alive. There were footsteps coming down the stairs. The boy called out softly for his father, but the house was dark and there was no answer. He went to the kitchen where he usually found his father eating a late-night meal of reheated leftovers, but tonight the kitchen was empty and cold from an open window over the sink. A layer of snow had accumulated inside the window. The boy stepped in something wet. There were several small puddles of water leading away from the kitchen to the mudroom closet, where clothes were tossed about carelessly on the floor. The closet door was open, and despite the darkness, the boy thought he saw something standing inside the closet. He called again for his father, and the figure moved a little in acknowledgement. Slowly, the figure stepped forward. A thick, heavy overcoat emerged from the closet as if it were floating toward him. The overcoat quivered, and he heard something faintly inside the coat, a strange rattling sound, like dry twigs scraping and bumping together in a breeze. The overcoat halted, and he saw now that supporting the coat were two bony, shivering legs. Skeletal hands with long, narrow fingers crawled out from the sagging sleeves like giant white spiders emerging from their holes. The hands, their fingers like monstrous claws, pulled open the overcoat to reveal a skull with its cavernous sockets and jaw hung in a wide, toothy smile. In a rasping, growling voice, the skeleton spoke its horrible name, Lickabones, 3 syllables to scare anyone out of their skin. The boy screamed, and the shrill, piercing sound tore through his body like a fillet knife. The scream reverberated through the boy's body, separating flesh from muscle and fat until his skin fell in thick red folds with a wet, slapping sound onto the floor. The boy's skinless cadaver stood for a split moment, his lidless eyes and gaping mouth locked in a silent scream before collapsing to the floor. Lickabones threw aside the overcoat and slid inside the loose skin, pulling it first over his legs and then up and over the rest of his skeleton. The skin stretched tightly over his bare bones, their outlines visible beneath the taut flesh. Rapturous warmth washed over the skeleton. For the first time since he awoke in his grave, his rattling bones stopped shivering, and his teeth quit chattering. Lickabones walked quietly up the stairs to the boy's bedroom and crawled under the warm, heavy sheets. The snowstorm was howling fiercely when the boy's mother awoke suddenly in the night. Immediately, she was hit with an overwhelming feeling of dread. The echo of a shrill scream still lingered in her brain like a bad dream. Whether she had actually heard the sound or dreamt it, she was unsure. She listened closely to the storm, hoping for some gust of wind to replicate the scream she thought she heard. She went down the hallway to her son's bedroom and cracked open the door. Her son was huddled beneath the blankets. All that was visible was his messy brown hair peeking out from the tops of the covers. The blankets shifted a little, and she thought she heard something as she shut the door. A faint rattling sound, like dry twigs scraping together in a breeze. Alan finished reading the story. He was nearly at the end of the book. His palm was stained with dry blood from the paper cut hours ago. He was numb to the growling hunger pains that gnawed at his stomach. All concern for his missing mother was gone, replaced with his mad desire to keep reading. There was one final page left to read. Unable to resist the book's hold over him, he flipped to the last and final page. Upon that page was a short poem. He read it, his expression filled with fear and confusion as he did so. You've reached the final page and devoured every word, not knowing that as you did, a terrible debt was incurred. The moment you found this book, you were surely doomed. For every word you read, a piece of you was consumed. We bid you farewell, you've been a savory treat, and when they come searching, all they'll find is this book and an empty seat. You're nearly at the end, the final words are here, and when you finish reading them, you'll fade away and disappear. The book fell from Alan's trembling hands to the floor. He was suddenly aware of the pain in his hand and the nausea in his empty stomach. He was desperately thirsty and his throat was so dry that speaking was painful. He tried to stand up. His strength gave out and he collapsed into the chair. His eyes were all he could move. He didn't recognize his body. The belly that had hung out over his belt was gone. His pants were slipping off his waist. The muscles in his arms and legs were atrophied and the loose, dry skin hung from them. A searing headache made it impossible for him to think. He was already forgetting the story he just read. The library seemed to be swirling around him in a blur. His eyelids fell shut. The pain was replaced with a feeling of emptiness, a total indifference to his body, thoughts, and surroundings. His body withered until he evaporated into a pale white vapor that was sucked into the open book. Its meal finished, the book slammed itself shut. The pages and cover were now blank, and would remain so until the book ensnared a new victim with an irresistible story made uniquely for them. The house sat empty for a year until it was eventually auctioned, and the furniture and belongings therein sold or donated. A librarian sat alone in the back office unpacking a donation of books from a cardboard box, tediously entering each book into the computer system according to its author and subject. It was after hours, and the lights in the parking lot were flickering on one by one. She reached into the nearly empty box and pulled out the last book. It was a purple leather hardcover with gold trim on the pages. It was a mystery novel titled The Missing Staircase, written by Simon Knight. She devoured mystery novels, and was surprised to find one she had never heard of. It was getting late, but not so late that she couldn't at least read the first few pages. After all, it was only 7 o'clock and tomorrow was a holiday. It was such a wonderful book, and she just couldn't bring herself to put it down, not until she consumed every last word.
And that concludes tonight's scary story. You can find more original stories like the one you just heard and other creepy content by listening to the Trunk Stories Productions podcast, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find podcasts these days. Seasons 1 and 2 are available now. Season 3 premieres on May 1st, 2023. You can visit us at trunkstories.org. That's TRUNK stories.org. Links are available in the episode description.